Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, cultivating deep discipleship in community. I'm Brian Fisher.
And I'm Kyle Moody.
And we are greenhousing, there's that verb again,
Yep.
Episode 66, which was called Everybody Hates Brian.
That's not true.
No, it's hyperbole.
I understand.
You know,
but I
funny.
take exception to that because I don't like the fact that you're assuming that everybody
No,
hates
I don't. It's just
I know. It's your humor and it's your, I get it, but I don't like it. I'm just being honest.
Fair enough. We're talking about the end times.
Yep.
Which has been a conversation that we've been avoiding for a year and a half. However, it is, in my view, very important to understand different views and understand how those views are arrived at, because it actually does impact how we function and operate in the world as disciples. Mm-hmm. So I am sensitive to the fact that many folks think this is a peripheral issue, and it is peripheral compared to salvation.
Now, real quick, explain what you mean by that when you say it's a peripheral issue.
There's a general sense that there are issues which are essential or central to the faith, aka what does it mean to be saved, become a Christian, to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. And then there are issues that are normally considered not essential. They're peripheral. They're on the outside.
I gotcha.
And we don't really have to agree on those in terms of what is essential for our salvation or our being in Christ. So that's the general sense of the word.
Okay. So things like, you're saying that things like end times views, communion, baptism, those are peripheral views. To some people,
yeah. It depends. Okay. If you're a Baptist, you might consider Baptist to be a little bit more essential.
I got you. Okay. No, I got you. I'm tracking with you. All right.
So the premise of 66 is, hey, look, unity is not normally achieved by just making a list of things we don't agree with and saying we're not going to talk about them. Unity is actually when we can sit down and have meaningful, honoring debate and discussion and wrestle with these things together. Even if we don't agree, we have a deeper understanding of our hearts and we can deepen our love for one another. Now, I'm not sure that's the norm today, but in terms of what we're doing in greenhouses and how Soil and Roots functions, we invite this type of discussion in the appropriate settings for the process of deepening the relationship, even if we end up not agreeing on the topic at the end. Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yes,
okay.
Which all sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
But then when you actually put it into practice, I think that's when problems occur.
Well, it requires, obviously a common understanding among the people that are getting together. That if I disagree with you, it's not an indictment on you and your heart. Mm-hmm. It's not an indictment on your salvation. It's not even an indictment on your value or your identity. We disagree, and we're going to wrestle through it together and see if we can come to common ground. Even if we don't, we're going to hug and part friends and shake hands.
And again, sounds great. Sounds wonderful. But like what Tim said the last time he was here, was that if you hold true to something and you've been raised in that, and, let's say you have a very strong connection with the people that instilled those beliefs in you, if somebody comes along and starts to say, well, wait a minute, maybe that's not entirely true, or maybe let's look at that from a different perspective. It's very easy to get defensive.
Sure.
And to be like, wait a minute, because you're not just disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with my entire family tree, basically, or all of the people that I hold dear or whatever. And that's when it gets really sticky.
And I think that's where the underlying hidden ideas that drive us have to be based on the ethic of love. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm not advocating that every time that we run across somebody who has a different end times view that we should get into debate. I'm not arguing that at all.
No. I'm
saying for the purpose of becoming a deep disciple and engaging in these hidden ideas and assumptions in that context, wherever it is, if it's in a small group or a church or family, great. The greenhouse is intended for that. That's part of the purpose of what that group does. Then that is a safe, honoring, appropriate place to have those dialogues for the purpose of deepening our understanding and growing in love for each other.
Right. I mean, Jesus gave us the blueprint for that with his 12 disciples.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about 12 dudes that
radically different perspective. Yeah.
Oh, and that was his way of showing, I think, how you can do stuff like this in a place of love and all of them are drawing closer to Jesus.
Yeah.
All of them are learning more about him. They had vastly different views, vastly different backgrounds. They all
got together.
Exactly.
Worked out, except for one.
Well, yeah, that's true. Well, first of all, I think we need to address the chiastic thing, because you said that you were the only thing that you hated was that I was in the room, and that now you'll never hear the end of it. I just want to say that I would never chastise you for using the word chiastic wrong, because honestly, I didn't even know when you guys were talking about that. I was like, please don't ask me about this, because I don't even remember what the word means. And then chiasmus, is that the proper form or whatever?
Yes, that's the noun
Okay,
form,
I was like, oh, that's a deep ditch. No, it's not. So I'm just glad that never happened, and I just want to clear the air that if you're using words the wrong way, chances are I won't even know. But if I do, I'll be like, hey, you know what? Let's ask Tim about that, what that actually means.
You know, I mean, I've gotten 2 or 3 comments this week that people saying, you're really mean to Kyle. Do you not like him? I'm like, hold up a sec. Look, our relationship has been properly characterized by people, not us.
No.
As 2 old women sitting in a nursing home bickering.
Yep.
Like that's sort of the nature of our friendship. Mm-hmm. And I do actually try to Easter egg you on the episodes that you're not here.
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to teach you how to be sarcastic. I'm failing miserably. You're just not picking up on it.
But see, I never, because it was interesting that you said that the end times was a topic of discussion that was regularly batted around.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Never
Really?
in my no.
Where did you grow up?
Where?
Yeah.
In Texas.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, my paternal grandfather was a Southern Baptist minister. And it was just never discussed. If anything, it was just, the world is messed up and Jesus is going to come back, but there was never like a rapture word put on it. It was just.
What type of church did you grow up in? Baptist?
Yeah, we did that Methodist, Nazarene, Presbyterian. We kind of bounced around to different denominations. So
no, it was deeply embedded in our culture, and it wasn't just our church. It was. I mean, I recall having lots of discussions about end times at school and in youth group. I mean, it was just sort of a fairly regular topic of conversation, and we were sort of saturated in it just culturally. When I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, so maybe it was more of a thing there. I don't know, but yeah, it was deeply embedded into the sort of the psyche of us growing up.
But yeah, so let's talk about the 4 views, because I think I've kind of got my head wrapped around it. But again, up until my 30s, like my mid 30s, I was then introduced to kind of the pre-trib, post-trib, like pre-tribulation, post-tribulation kind of mentality. And so this amillennialism, postmillennialism, all this stuff is very, very new.
Yeah.
And so I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. So let me just see if I can if I can recite them the right way. Okay. So premillennialism means that there is a 1,000-year reign, and that there is no rapture in that one. Or there's a thought of a rapture. Maybe some of them think that.
Normally not, as best as I can tell.
Premillennialism is no real rapture is involved.
But there is a literal 1,000-year with Jesus on the earth, typically. That's part of that system.
So so then that means that Jesus comes back and he's hanging out for 1,000 years. And then what happens after that?
Usually, Satan is released, and then there's Armageddon, the final battle, and then that wraps things up. That's grossly oversimplified, but that's
right.
That's
but then
the typical
and then so after that, it's just eternity and
new heaven, new earth.
Okay, all right. So that's premillennialism.
Jesus returning before a literal 1,000 years.
Okay, so then postmillennialism is the rapture. Nope. Okay. See, here I thought
the rapture is typically inside dispensationalism.
Okay.
That's
so then postmillennialism is...
That's very different. Postmillennialism says that Jesus is coming after the millennium. I've said that word so many times
right?
I can't say it right.
It's a tongue twister. Yeah.
Jesus is coming after a millennium. And postmillennialists, they're not usually all that rigid on it being an actual 1,000-year period. But Jesus comes only after this age of history is done, and it's just sort of a one and done. So their view is that whether the church age is the millennium or not, that the world is going to wind up, that the world's going to become increasingly Christianized. They would say the Great Commission is going to be extremely successful, and that evangelism will continue to be very successful, and that it's more of a sense of Jesus through the church is preparing the world for his triumphant second coming, and we are preparing the world in advance for that event.
So, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but with those two, the big difference would be premillennialism.
Just say premill.
Premill. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Premill is when Jesus comes back, it's catastrophic.
Yeah, premill typically has the idea that the world is winding down prior to Jesus and the millennium.
So it kind of goes into what you were saying, like the rescue kind of mission. So he's rescuing us from the state of the world as it is at that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then post-mills, it's more of a triumphant return, like the world and the earth.
Well, it's triumphant in both cases, but it's the progression of the world prior to him returning.
Right,
is the difference.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like the state of the world when he comes back. So the state of the world in pre-mill is pretty bleak.
Yeah.
Post-mill is things are pretty good.
Right.
I mean, things are much better than they are. Okay.
Right.
All right. So then there's mills.
Right.
I'm sorry, I tried to do it again, and I'm not going to.
You wouldn't believe how many times I've had to
I'm sure.
retake things in the podcast.
Oh, I'm sure. So mills again. Now I'm not even going to try. So mills are what's the
they view
Cliff's
the
notes?
millennium as the same thing as the church age. So the entire time period between Christ's ascension and the second coming, that whole thing is the millennium. So you and I, according to them, right now are in the millennium.
Okay, and it's the same kind of thing with post-mill, is that he'll come when the world is winding up?
No, well, not normally. All mills tend to see evil and good. It's a strange way to say it. But the gospel and the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness sort of at a perpetual war. And they tend to see the world moving more in cycles. So it's not typically winding up. It's sort of a bouncing around. And at some point, Jesus is going to come and finish the job.
So it could be when it's up or when it's down. There's not really a...
Yeah, they're not really concerned about that.
Okay.
They don't predict a dire end, but they also don't predict a great end prior to the second coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then dispensationalism, that's the fourth, and that's the one that is really rapture centric, and that's the one that kind of hinges around that.
Yeah. Although it seems to be in some corners, it seems to be changing, but historically. The sequence of events with those who hold the dispensationalism, which is basically it's a subset of premillennialism. They have a lot in common. That there's a rapture, Jesus rescuing believers prior to a specific 7-year tribulation. Normally, lots of war and chaos and bloodshed, and then Jesus comes again in the second coming, sets up the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, and then at the end of that, you have the final battle between Jesus and the enemy and wraps up. Dispensationalism is pretty, just like postmillennialism says, yeah, the world's winding up. Dispensationalism says, no, the world's winding down. They both take a pretty strong stance on the direction of the world according to their different views of the end times.
Because I'm trying to wrap my head around this, because again, this is vastly different than the mindset and the teaching that I grew up with. It was never into this kind of depth. It was just all very, when you say peripheral, it was all very abstract. There was no
I think that's most people
dwelling on it.
I honestly think that's where probably most people are.
Yeah.
The difference in postmills is that postmillennialism doesn't hold to Jesus physically being present during the millennium. He's still in heaven reigning from there. Premills and dispensationalists tend to say, no, Jesus is physically here in Jerusalem ruling.
For the 1,000 years?
Yeah.
Okay. And then...
It's very... This is why people don't go into it.
Right. Well,
there's so many different... And there's different nuances of everything I just said.
Right.
So.
Okay. But again, I think, and we were talking about this, is that I think it's healthy to, kind of scratch the surface with this and try to get your brain wrapped around it to understand, okay, what do I think? What do I believe? And how does that affect how I live out my Christian life?
Yeah.
Because I think with all four of these, whichever one you identify with or whichever one you're drawn to, it makes a pretty big impact on how you disciple people or what you think your mission here or your purpose here is on earth.
Right. Yeah, I'm in episode, where are we at? 67. In episode 70, I'm actually going to sort of explore just pieces of this, which is the world is winding down view versus the world is winding up view. We're just going to pick two and say, okay, let's actually play those out and let's explore how those might impact our spiritual formation and our discipleship. So we're going to do, we're not going to spend a whole lot of episodes on this, but we're going to at least dig into, because I think that's a practical example. If you hold to the idea the world is winding down, that has an impact on how we function and operate in the world. If you view the world as winding up, which is by far the minority view today, that's going to affect the type of things that we do and how we view the world. It's deeply embedded into the psyche, and it certainly impacts how we operate.
Now, when you said it's the world is winding up, that's a minority view now.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that has been the case for a long period of time, or is that something relatively new?
That it's a minority view?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you go back, and I'm not a historian, but like Jonathan Edwards is one of the more famous post-mill thinkers of the last 400 or 500 years, at least in this corner of the world. And I think there's a sense that post-mill was more of a view, 1700s. The rise of dispensationalism, which sort of became codified in the 1800s, that interpretation has been wildly successful at influencing, all the seven mountains of culture. I mean, the rapture motif, think of the Marvel movies. You have, if you've watched those, in Avengers Infinity War, at the end, the villain snaps his fingers and half of the universe's living beings disappear. And in other movies, you see planes falling out of skies and worldwide bloodshed and, chaos and terror. It's hard to watch that and not see rapture sort of imagery, because those are the, if you've ever read the Left Behind series or watched or read books. So dispensationalism, more in America and more in the early 1900s, just, grabbed hold of a lot of the Protestant populations. And then, the nation of Israel they got their land back in 1948. All those sort of events have propelled dispensationalism into the most popular, widespread. And again, I'm not sure how many people would even say, "Oh, I'm dispensational." I'm not even sure they relate rapture, tribulation, literal millennium to that term. But it's become, in popular Christianity, it's still by far the most dominant, the most dominant system. So we need to recognize that and understand how that's impacted areas of life. Post-mill, as you might imagine, it's a little bit of a hard sell, whether it's right or wrong. But,
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well,
what do you mean it's a hard sell?
The idea is that the world's going to become increasingly Christianized, including all seven mountains of culture. I mean, it views as a comprehensive Christianization of the world. And, if you are looking at a long time period, like a thousand years, you might say, there's some areas where that makes sense. I mean, we've made some great strides in terms of assuming Christian ideas. But, if you look at the 20th century, it's the bloodiest century in world history. 100 million people dead from communism. You're gonna look back and say, really? I mean, how does this play out? So we'll explore that a little bit more in episode 70, because I'm going to share some of the questions that I have about postmillennialism, just honest gut questions. But it has been a minority view for 100, 150 years at least, and dispensationalism has been the predominant view. Well,
and wouldn't you agree that looking around at what's happening right now, it's easier to think that the world is winding down?
Sure.
And that,
especially since we're in,
I mean, that's
especially, and I've made this point before, especially because we're just inundated
right
with 99.9% negative news.
So the level of chaos, the level of, if you want to say evil or wickedness in the world now, I think a lot of people would say, oh, it's so much worse now than it ever has been in history. But is it possible that it is almost, if it's not the same or maybe even a little less than some periods of history, they just didn't know what was going on?
I don't know if it can be measured. I'm not sure how to answer that question, because how do you measure what's destructive and what isn't in terms of a way that's quantifiable?
But do you see, like,
I get the point.
I'm not trying to get down to the number.
No, last year I was on a call with Glenn Sunshine. So Dr. Glenn Sunshine. I've quoted him before. He's a really interesting thinker. And he was sort of addressing this and said, hey, look, if we were sitting in 13th century England and half of the population was being wiped out by the Black Plague, we could probably make a case that that was the worst time in history. And what he's saying is we have great difficulty assessing our own situation because we're no longer students of history. So we tend to look at the way the world is going through a very limited set of lenses, basically our lifetime in our corner of the world. So we say, oh, world history must be, this is unconscious, world history must be proceeding as my life is proceeding, or as the world around me that I can visibly see is proceeding. So we do live in an age, I think there's two things that have sort of changed the calculus. I think the nuclear age has had a profound impact on how we view things, because previous ages did not have access to a technology that could wipe out intentionally potentially the world.
Right.
So you have, here's Hiroshima, and then you have Cuban Missile Crisis, you have the nuclear age. That had a profound impact, I think, on the church and on cultural thinking. And we now live in that reality. Now, do we think about it every day like we probably did in the 70s or 80s? No. But there's still this sort of underlying sense that we know. Like if somebody gets mad enough, they can
put their finger on a button.
Prior to that, it was never assumed that human beings could do that. There were natural disasters. I mean, Pompeii, you know what I mean? Like localized natural disasters that could have that sort of destruction, but not that the president's sitting there with a suitcase with two keys that could wipe out, entire continents. So we got to factor that into our consideration. That's fairly new, obviously, in world history. And technology would be the second one, because to your point, unlike any other age in history, we're walking around with 3x5 devices that'll give us any information we want at any time from anywhere in the world. So, we're on information overload. I'm not sure our brains were wired to handle all that we get, but it's deeply formative.
It does take a lot of courage to even touch this stuff, because some people are like, I'm not even going near it. But I think the way that you have done it and the way that you are presenting it is the model of how we can have these conversations. And it's not about, we're not sitting here trying to tell people this is right, this is wrong, this is what you should think. It's, let's dig into this. Let's really wrestle with it and come at it from a place of love. But also, it's okay to disagree.
Right.
It's okay to think, well, wait a minute. I don't understand that. Help me understand what you mean by that. Because I'm not gelling with that. Oh, okay. Well, here, and at the end of the day, like you said, I mean, it sounds so corny when you say it, but like shake hands and leave as friends. It's just like, yay. But I get the vibe. It's like, okay.
Look, here's the bottom line premise is that my love for you and your love for me grows through our wrestling through these things versus our ignoring and putting them on the sideline. That's why I'm using the marriage reference. So if you're married, you can create a list of all the types of things that you're not going to talk about because they're going to create conflict. But after a while, you run out of things to talk about. Now, you're still married. We're married. We're good. But that marriage is not a flourishing, healthy, growing marriage. And in the church, we can reduce the things we're going to talk about to, this is how you become a Christian, and eventually we're going to go to heaven. We could be married, right? We could be Christian, and then hang out with people that just have all of our same views. Or we can courageously say, well, let's take all the list of stuff we're not going to talk about, and let's pick 2 or 3, and let's wrestle with them, assuming that if we have our best interests at heart, and that's got to be at the bottom of the equation, right? That I have your best interests at heart, you have my best interests at heart, that we are going to wrestle through these things, understanding that through that conflict, we will grow and change and grow to love each other more, just like that's the recipe in a marriage.
But at the same time, when you're doing that, like there was a long period in my marriage where I did that. We were just like, let's just ignore the things that are different.
Right.
Let's just,
Sure.
we're not going to touch that. Right. There is an extraordinary amount of trust that has to take place when you venture into that, because it's
risky.
It's absolutely
risk.
Because then you think you've got to trust that not only is it going to be good for our marriage, it's going to strengthen it in a way that never would have happened had we not had that conversation.
And has that been true?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
and
so-
that's what happens with Jesus multiplied by 100.
Right.
And I think that's what keeps people from doing it is because they're afraid.
But, well, and the fear is
It's very real.
It's justified
Of
because
course.
love is in its essence risk. Our hearts are going to be broken. We are going to have hurt feelings. We are at times going to walk away feeling wounded. Sometimes we just lose people. We give ourselves to them. We take that risk. We express that vulnerability, and they still leave. So there's I mean, if anybody Jesus understood this anybody better than anybody else on the planet. So he loved his disciples. He gave himself to them, and when push came to shove, they all bailed. So, we'll talk about this more as we get into the how to live in the kingdom. But living in the kingdom is risky. Loving is risky. Wrestling with people is risky, and there's no way to mitigate that risk.
Right. But Jesus will never let us down. He will never walk away.
Well, and
he will never bail.
And do you not have the same sorts of fidelity, I guess is the word, faithfulness in your marriage? You now know, because you've wrestled through these things, you know what, we might hurt each other's feelings, we might be bummed out for a few hours or a few days, but we're rock solid.
Right.
We're not going anywhere.
Right.
Yeah, when somebody says, hey, we've heard, Jessica and I have heard this before, hey, we've never argued, that marriage is in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
They don't know it, but that marriage is in trouble.
Oh, well,
because conflict comes through, growth comes through conflict.
Right, exactly. So at the end of your episode, you quoted N.T. Wright, which I had no idea who he was until you recommended the book, How God Became King, which completely blew my mind, and I absolutely loved it. But then the quote that you left with, I want to just hover on that for a little bit because I think it was a genius quote to put in there, and the last part of that is basically encapsulates everything that we're trying to talk about. So let's just go into that. So he said, anyone who has worked within biblical scholarship knows or ought to know that we biblical scholars come to the text with just as many interpretive strategies and expectations as anyone else. And that, here we go, integrity consists not of having no presuppositions, but of being aware of what one's presuppositions are and the obligation to listen to and interact with those who have different ones. I mean, all I see in my mind is somebody that's the mic drop right there. I mean, that in part of that quote is just such a perfect way to tee off what we're doing. This is the whole point, to be able to know that, yes, I do have my thoughts. I do have my beliefs. I have the things that are baked in me. That's just as evident in someone else. But let's listen to each other, and maybe we can draw some inspiration, or we can draw closer to Jesus with these differing opinions, possibly.
Right.
And allowing the Holy Spirit to guide us through that, and trusting that He can do that.
Well, N.T. Wright is, some people love him and some people detest him. It depends on kind of your frame of reference. He is, whether you like him or not, he's a fascinating thinker. And I think what he's doing here is restating what we've been saying for 67 episodes, which is being awake, being attuned, digging into our hearts to uncover the hidden ideas that shape us and form us in culture and church. So where we're going in 68, which is already written, which is amazing that I'm actually ahead, but that deals with the presuppositions, the assumptions, the undergirding, sometimes hidden ideas that actually sit at the bottom of these four views. And my concern is that if we are debating, we're typically debating in the leaves and the branches instead of at the roots of what these interpretations actually mean. So we're gonna go really deep with the help of some other great thinkers and try to establish a framework in which to have these conversations so that we're all talking about the same thing.
Love it.
And I think what Wright is saying is very important. Again, these ideas, these systems, these ways of interpreting, you and I are not the people developing these. Like, we don't have the time. We don't have I don't have the smarts. Like, these are developed over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years by theologians and scholars that this is what they do. And they're digging into the ancient languages. They're digging into other thinkers from out church history. They're digging into archaeology. They're digging into textual criticism. They're digging into all these pieces. And by the time they get to us, we're getting like 5% of all the good stuff that's behind these things. But what Wright is saying is even those guys are coming with certain suppositions and certain assumptions. And we're obligated, I think, to some degree to understand those if we're going to assume a strong position so that we have we're at the root. We understand what it's at the very base of these four views of which there's so much disagreement. So I close with that because it's a great lead into what I'm going to attempt to do in 68, which is say, hey, look, can we simplify these four things down to the very roots in a gross overgeneralization to where we can at least have conversations starting at the root level instead of trying to figure this out, what is Gog and Magog and what does the mark of the beast mean? Those are interesting questions, but they're actually based on the roots of the systems, not the leaves. So I think it's going to be a fascinating journey. And I like the Wright quote because he's advocating for what we're trying to do. This is what we've been doing for the entire 3 seasons. Hey, great discussion today.
Yes.
Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it.
This was so much fun.
I was successfully nice to you for the entire time.
Yes. And again, I appreciate that. And
I'm a work in progress, but I'm going to Easter egg you in the next episode anyway.
I love it. We're all works in progress, and I see it as they're compliments.
We're wrestling together.
When we're bickering, I see it as compliments. So I welcome it, and I want you to be comfortable with who you are.
I am quite comfortable.
Good. Then I've done my job.
Hey, if you like the podcast, share the podcast. Our audience and greenhouse communities and soil and roots community grow as you continue to spread the word. If you enjoy this deep dive into the ideas that form us, the church and the culture, tell your friends, and you can always go rate the podcast on your favorite platform. We are a nonprofit organization, so if you'd like to financially support us, we'd love for that to happen. You can go to the website at soilandroots.org and make your online donation there. This series is a lot of fun. 68 is going to be great, so can't wait to get to 69 and have us greenhouse that. In the meantime, if you have questions, give us an email at fish@soilandroots.org, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Good job.
Thanks.